In the early hours of September 17th, 1928, the people living around Lake Okeechobee stepped out into a scene so horrific that even trained rescuers struggled to comprehend it. The rising sun revealed bodies tangled in trees, homes swept miles from their foundations, families missing, and fields turned into shallow lakes stretching as far as the eye could see. Thousands had died in a matter of hours, swept away by a wall of water that erupted out of Lake Okeechobee when its fragile levee failed in the middle of the night. More than 2,500 people were killed, and yet this remains one of the least known disasters in American history. The 1928 Okeechobee Hurricane is a storm so destructive, so overwhelming, that the full truth of what happened has almost faded from memory. And what unfolded that night would forever change hurricane policy in the state of Florida. The story begins almost 2 weeks earlier and thousands of miles away. In early September 1928, a powerful Cape Verde hurricane formed off the coast of Africa and began its westward march across the Atlantic. Meteorology in the 1920s was extremely limited. There were no satellites, no hurricane hunters, and almost no real time tracking. Forecasting relied on scattered ship reports and coastal barometers. As this storm strengthened, ships recorded massive waves and rapidly falling pressure, early signs of a dangerous storm. By the time it reached the Caribbean, it was already a strong Category 4 hurricane. On September 12th, the hurricane slammed into Puerto Rico, causing catastrophic destruction. Winds of around 145 miles per hour ripped roofs from homes, destroyed churches, schools, and entire communities. More than 300 people died in Puerto Rico, and tens of thousands were left homeless. Instead of weakening, the storm maintained its strength as it crossed the island and moved back over warm water. Its next target was South Florida. By 1928, the region around Lake Okeechobee had undergone a rapid economic transformation. This was the heart of Florida's growing agricultural industry. Sugar farms and vegetable fields stretched across the rich soil south of the lake. Railroads, including the Florida East Coast Railway and the Atlantic Coast Line, transported sugar cane, beans, and produce across the state. New towns had sprung up around these rail lines. Belle Glade, Pahokee, South Bay, and other small farming communities were populated largely by migrant laborers. Many were African American workers from the Deep South and Bahamian immigrants who came seeking seasonal farm work. The promise of abundant land and steady pay brought people in, but living conditions were harsh. Workers lived in flimsy wooden shacks built directly on low-lying ground. They had few resources, limited transportation, and no political influence, and most critically, they lived directly in the path of a disaster they did not know was coming. Lake Okeechobee itself was a natural lake held in place by only a small sand ridge on the southern side. This ridge was not an engineered levee, it was simply a naturally formed berm, uneven in height and never designed to hold back massive storm surge. Engineers had warned in previous years that a major hurricane could cause catastrophic flooding if the lake rose too high, but no large scale action had been taken. By September 14th, the storm was closing in on Florida. Weather stations across the region recorded rapidly falling pressure, an unmistakable sign of an approaching hurricane. Warnings were issued in coastal cities like Palm Beach and West Palm Beach, but inland communities received far less communication. Many local farmers stayed behind to protect their livestock and crops. Migrant workers had no means to evacuate even if they wanted to. On the evening of September 16th, the storm made landfall near Palm Beach with around 140-mile-per-hour winds. Homes were torn apart, palm trees snapped, and debris flew through the air. The intense winds pushed the northern part of Lake Okeechobee downward, forcing billions of gallons of water toward the southern edge of the lake. The natural sand ridge trembled under the mounting pressure. Around 1 a.m., the ridge finally gave way. Survivors described the sound as a thunderous explosion followed by a roar like a freight train. A massive wall of water, approximately 10 to 14 feet high, burst through the breach and surged southward. Entire neighborhoods of wooden houses were swept away in seconds. People inside were thrown into the rushing waters before they could react. The water moved incredibly fast across the flat land. Because the region sits only a few feet above sea level, there was nothing to slow the flood. Some residents woke to find water smashing through their walls. Some climbed onto rooftops. Others ran out into the storm hoping to find higher ground. But the wind was still near hurricane strength, and debris struck people as they tried to escape. The water was filled with cattle, horses, uprooted trees, and pieces of houses. Many people drowned within minutes in the darkness, unable to see or hear anything clearly over the roar of the storm. Railroad workers trying to secure equipment were swept away. Entire sugar farms disappeared underwater, leaving behind only twisted metal and fragments of machinery. Migrant labor camps suffered the highest death toll. Many lived in low areas directly in the path of the flood and were overwhelmed almost instantly. Historians believe that hundreds of Bahamian immigrants died that night, but their deaths were never officially recorded. In some communities, entire families vanished without a trace. By sunrise, the storm had passed, but the destruction was almost beyond comprehension. Water covered more than 100 square miles south of the lake. Bodies floated in the fields and canals. Survivors wandered in shock, searching for loved ones, some carrying children who did not survive. Homes were gone, roads were erased, and the landscape had transformed into a shallow, debris-filled sea. The rescue and recovery operations began almost immediately, but the challenges were enormous. Roads were destroyed, rail lines were twisted and broken, and bridges had collapsed. Rescuers had to use boats, wagons, and even makeshift rafts to reach survivors. Medical supplies were limited. Many of the injured had spent hours in dirty floodwater filled with sharp debris and animal carcasses. Disease was a major fear, especially in the Florida heat. The bodies presented another overwhelming challenge. The number of dead was so large that identifying them was nearly impossible. Some bodies were found miles from where the victims had lived, carried away by the flood. Others were buried under rubble or tangled in mangroves. One of the most unsettling and painful parts of the aftermath was how the dead were treated differently based on race. In the days following the flood, the sheer number of bodies overwhelmed every rescue crew. The heat was intense, disease was a real threat, and decomposition happened quickly. Cremation and mass burials were used out of necessity, but the way victims were separated revealed the social inequalities of the time. White victims, whether from farming families or newly settled towns, were far more likely to receive individual burials when identification was possible. Their bodies were often taken to established cemeteries, placed in caskets, and buried with names recorded on paper. Some families who survived arranged private funerals once conditions allowed. Churches stepped in to assist with these burials, and local officials made efforts to keep burial records for white victims whenever they could. For black victims, the process was drastically different. Most black laborers lived in the lowest areas around the lake, the places hit first by the surge of water. Entire camps of black migrant families were drowned. Their bodies were recovered in far larger numbers and placed into wagons before being taken to makeshift burial sites. Officials organized large trenches where hundreds of black victims were buried together without caskets. The most well-known of these mass graves is in West Palm Beach, where more than 600 black victims were buried in a single pit. This mass grave was not given a proper marker at the time. The burial was treated as a sanitation measure rather than a memorial. There were no headstones, no public ceremony, and no official attempt to preserve the memory of those who died. For decades, the site was neglected. At one point, a road passed near it, and homes were built around it without residents even knowing what the ground once contained. Grass grew over the grave, and many people in the community had no idea it was there. Meanwhile, white victims buried individually received proper headstones or recorded burial locations. Their names appeared in newspapers and official lists. Family members could visit grave sites. The contrast was stark, and historians often describe it as one of the clearest examples of racial inequality in disaster response during the early 20th century. It was not until the late 1990s and early 2000s that renewed attention was brought to the forgotten mass grave of black victims. Community leaders, historians, and descendants of survivors pushed for recognition. The city of West Palm Beach eventually installed a memorial to honor the hundreds who were buried there. A historical marker was placed at the site, acknowledging both the tragedy and the racial injustice of how the burials were handled. Today, it stands as one of the few public reminders of how the 1928 hurricane exposed not only the power of nature, but also the deep social divides of the era. The official death toll was just over 2,500, but most historians agree that the real number was much higher. Because migrant laborers were not documented by local government offices, their deaths often went unrecorded. Some estimates place the true number between 3,000 and 3,500. This makes the 1928 Okeechobee Hurricane one of the deadliest natural disasters in U.S. history. In the weeks after the storm, the political aftermath began. The disaster had exposed massive failures in Florida's infrastructure, planning, and communication. Newspapers across the state demanded accountability. Residents demanded answers about why the levee had never been strengthened despite years of warnings. The federal government stepped in, assigning the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to design and construct a real protective barrier around Lake Okeechobee. This led to the construction of the Herbert Hoover Dike, a 143-mile-long levee system built throughout the 1930s and 1940s. It was one of the largest flood control projects in American history. Over the decades, the dike has been rebuilt, reinforced, and modernized, and it remains essential today. Without it, the communities south of the lake would still be at risk of another catastrophe. Despite the enormous scale of the disaster, the storm slowly faded from national memory. The Great Depression hit a year later, dominating headlines and overshadowing earlier events. Many of the victims were poor or from minority communities whose stories were not widely recorded. Over time, the memory of the 1928 hurricane nearly disappeared from American history books. But for the families who lived through it and for the communities built around Lake Okeechobee, the storm left a permanent scar. Entire neighborhoods had to be rebuilt. Farmland was destroyed for months. Businesses connected to the railroads and sugar farms suffered enormous losses. And thousands of graves, both marked and unmarked, became silent reminders of the night when the lake broke free. Today, when we speak of major hurricanes in Florida, we usually remember Andrew, Katrina, or Irma. But long before those storms, the 1928 Okeechobee Hurricane delivered a catastrophic warning about the power of water and the cost of ignoring vulnerable communities. It remains one of the deadliest storms in American history and a reminder of how essential forecasting, strong infrastructure, and disaster preparedness truly are. Thank you for watching this story. If you enjoyed learning something new today, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and leave a comment telling us what you thought of this story.